High noon turned Ash Mesa into a white anvil. Heat rang in the air. Dust stuck to the tongue. The windmill on the far end of town squealed once a dry hinge begging oil. Evelyn Harper stepped down from the stagecoach and set her wooden valise on the packed earth. Her palms were raw where the handle bit. Sweat ran a narrow line under her collar. She tasted metal. No one came forward. A boy stared from behind a rain barrel. A mule stamped and twitched at flies. The street belonged to the sun. He walked out of the glare like a figure cut from the hard light. Hat brim low, coat the color of the road. A pale scar grazed his left temple, a comma in skin. Rowan McKay stopped a few paces off, gaze steady but not sharp, taking her in the way a man counts fence posts. He tipped his head once. "I startle easy," he said in a voice rough as sanded oak. "I don't touch anyone unless they reach first." It was almost a joke, not quite. Her fingers tightened on the valise. She nodded without words. "Name's Rowan," he said. "Juniper, Well Ranch is half a mile. We can walk it." He lifted her suitcase as if it held eggs. He did not sling it. He held it upright, careful of the latch. The road out of Ash Mesa ran thin between yucca and scrub. Heat lifted off it in slow waves. Evelyn kept 2 steps behind him, the distance where fear breathes. He shortened his stride to meet hers. When he spoke, it was to the horizon. "Water pump is sound," he said. "Wind's been mean, but it breaks at sundown." The land opened around them. Juniper clung to rock. A vulture traced a slow loop overhead. The ranch house rose out of the glare, small and honest boards silvered by sun. A porch with a sag in the middle. A crooked cotton rope on a nail used to tie a gate open. Rowan set the valise on the porch and touched the door with his knuckles before he went in, as if knocking on his own house. It smelled of pine soap and hot iron, floorboards clean and plain, no curtains, a black stove that shone from use. Everything had edges but not sharp ones. He led her down a short hall and stopped at the last door. "This one is yours," he said. "Lock turns from the inside." He set a small brass key in her open palm without brushing her skin. The weight of it surprised her. Her throat worked once. She nodded again. "If you need anything," he said, "call out. I'll hear." She went in and shut the door. The key turned smooth in the latch. A square room, a narrow bed, a plain chair, a peg on the wall. She set the valise under the chair and sat on the edge of the bed with her travel dress still clinging to her knees. She did not light the lamp. Light came through the crack under the door, a dull ribbon across the floor. From outside, the windmill creaked and creaked, counting time. Night put a hollow in the house. Evelyn held her bottle of black ink like a stone. Her breath came shallow and slow. The door handle turned. One click. The door opened the width of her hand. She stood bottle up, heart banging against bone. Rowan's boots stayed in the hall. He did not look at her. In his hands, a folded wool blanket and a tin cup. "Nights get cold," he said low. "That quilt is thin." He crouched. He set the blanket on the floor just inside. He set the cup next to it. He did not step over the threshold. He closed the door by the edge with 2 fingers. Evelyn lowered the bottle, wrists trembling. The quiet returned, but it felt different. She reached down, picked up the blanket, pressed it to her ribs. It smelled faintly of sun and soap. Morning made the porch boards warm. A cup of coffee sat by the door, steam lifting in the cool. Beside it a biscuit with a smear of dark cactus jam wrapped in a clean square of cloth. Out by the shed, Rowan turned the blade of a hoe against a stone steel, whispering on stone. "Coffee is hot if you drink it," he called without turning. She drank. It was bitter and sweet, the jam catching on her teeth. A breeze came from the north, thin and polite. The windmill spun slow arcs, wood on wood. When she stepped off the porch and followed the sound toward the back, she found the gardens small and stubborn. Between rows of dry earth, a handful of white flowers raised their faces to nowhere. Evelyn knelt. Evening primrose, pale as breath. Rowan came up from the fence with a coil of wire in his hand. He took in her touched petals and glanced toward the flowers, then the sky. "My ma liked those," he said. "Told me if you plant what once made you happy, it might find its way back." Evelyn stayed kneeling with dirt under her nails. She did not answer. Her fingers found the thin stem and held it gentle as a throat. Beyond the fence, closer to the back pasture, a stump wore a black ring. Juniper. Char had licked it to the grain, but from the dark wood 2 stubborn shoots pushed a small green. Rowan saw where she looked. "Wind changes fast here," he said. "Comes down off the mesa without warning." He squinted at the line of hills. Not worried. Not easy either. The wind nudged the primrose and the petals shivered like paper. The rest of the house showed itself in quiet ways. In the kitchen, a row of spoons that matched. In the corner, a pair of boots set soles down. On the table, a tin of matches and a folded square of paper without writing. He moved around the rooms without noise, as if not to startle the boards. She noticed his hands, scar along the web between thumb and finger, a burn mark on the wrist pale against the sun. He kept away from her door. When he passed the hall, he looked down at the floorboards, not at the handle. When he needed flour, he stood on the other side of the room and asked with his chin. When he filled the water, he set the bucket and left her space to pass. The house learned both of them the angles where they would not bump. That evening, light went the color of brass. Flies settled. Evelyn washed her face in a basin, then pulled the blanket he had left into her lap to fold it clean. The wool rasped her skin. She shook it once to square the corners. A small metal sound hit the floor. She froze. A second key lay between her boots, bright and new. Smaller than the first, a slip of paper was tied to it with thread the color of twine. She picked it up. The paper smelled faintly of smoke from the stove. For your drawer, the note read, "Stow what is yours. No one touches it." Her fingers closed around the key. The windmill turned once and quieted. Somewhere in the yard, a horse snorted in its sleep. Evelyn sat still for a long moment, blanket on her lap, the new key in her fist. The house held its breath and waited with her. Morning took the chill out of the floorboards. Evelyn rolled the new key in her palm until the brass warmed, then slid open the small drawer of the bedside table. The key fit like a quiet yes. She set in what little she owned that felt like more than weight: a folded photograph, the journal with its stained ribbon, the bottle of ink that had felt like a weapon. She turned the key, felt the click, and breathed. The house hummed in low ways. Water ticked in a kettle. A fly hurled itself at a window and lost. The windmill took up its slow turning and spoke in an old wooden voice. Rowan moved through the front room with the careful silence of a man accustomed to listening first. When he passed the open kitchen doorway, he kept his eyes on the broom leaning against the wall and not on her hands. He saddled a gelding and was gone between one heartbeat and the next. Later he came back with salt blocks and a coil of wire across his shoulder. The morning stretched and folded. Evelyn learned the rhythm of doors, the sound of the hinge that caught the way to lift the latch so it did not shout. She swept dust into small, neat dunes and nudged them out with the toe of her boot. The air carried the faint blue bite of washing soap. At midday, she saw him from the window. He was in the yard with his sleeves rolled, high arms brown to the elbow blade of a hoe flipped upside down as he pried a stone from hardpan. His face was set toward the ground, not toward the house. He straightened, rolled his shoulders, and walked to the trough. He cupped water into his mouth and let the rest run cool over his wrist, the pale scar there flashing once. He came in and paused on the kitchen threshold. His boots stayed on the mat. He tipped his head at the cupboard. "Flour in there?" he asked. She nodded. He did not move. She stepped back and he crossed to the shelf with the kind of slow motion that did not scrape the air. He lifted the sack, set it on the table, and backed out again. No brush of sleeve, no breath shared. The day sloped toward heat haze. Somewhere out by the back fence, a cow bawled, and a magpie answered with something like a laugh. When the sun bent low, she heard the rhythm of hooves, quick and wrong. The horse Rowan rode in on came up hard, blowing white. Rowan dropped to the ground with a grunt he did not mean to make. His shirt stuck to one shoulder in a dark map. The cloth was torn and went wet at the edges. "I am fine," he said, which was not true. He reached for the cinch with his left hand and failed to make his fingers work the knot. Evelyn stepped forward before she could think. The smell hit her first. Sweat and iron and sun-heated leather. She set her palm near his elbow, not on it. "Sit," she said. He hesitated, surprised at the word, then let her steer him to the bench by the door. She went for the small brown bottle on the high shelf, for clean cloth, for a basin. He sat with his weight forward, as if ready to get up on command. Up close, his breath sounded like it had edges. "Shirt," she said, eyes on the knot in the thread, not on his. He unbuttoned slowly. The cloth came away from the wound with a soft rip that made her teeth ache. The cut across his shoulder was shallow and dirty. When she swabbed it, grit showed dark on white cloth. He did not flinch. On his back, a thicker scar ran from one shoulder blade to the far hip, pale and raised like old rope under skin. She could not help looking at that one. He felt her pause and kept his eyes on the doorway. "Tennessee," he said, voice steady from use. "Franklin. They ran me down outside town. I was scouting for Union. A patrol had boxed a church. Wanted someone to light it. Said freedom has a way to earn." He waited for the sting of the bottle to hit and sank into it. "I would not," he said. "They marked their lesson and left me to it." He did not say more. The room held his words and made no judgment. Evelyn folded fresh cloth over the new wound and tied it snug. Her fingers brushed the heat of his skin once. He blinked but did not look back at her. "There is carbolic on the shelf if you want it," she said. "Tonight, keep it clean." He nodded and stood slower than before. He pulled the shirt back over his arm, as if the fabric might bite. When he reached for the door, he stopped and turned half toward the kitchen table. His eyes flicked to the edge of a plate to the knife aligned with it to small domestic order. "Thank you," he said. She did not say it was nothing. It was not. The next morning came up bright and flat. Evelyn told him she needed to go into town. Rowan said only ledger at the general store is behind the counter. He reached into a drawer and brought out a small cloth purse. When he put it on the table, he did it where she could take it, without reaching around him. "Wind out of the west is ugly," he said. "If it picks up, come back the north road." She walked in under a sky that clicked with heat. Ash Mesa treated strangers like a shadow. The general store smelled of coffee ground and old flour. Shelves leaned under tins and sacks and a glass case of peppermint sticks that had fogged with years. The shopkeeper's wife had gray hair coiled into a bun that looked stern and was not. She counted out salt and calico and a tin of baking powder with quick fingers and soft notes about prices. Evelyn kept her voice small and square. A bell struck somewhere in the room that had nothing to do with the door. She felt it more than heard it. A man's voice came very close and low at the back of her neck. "Well now, look at that. Ash never did wash out easy." The air left her lungs in a rush. She turned and the room slid an inch. Cal Rooker stood too near, too lean, teeth stained at the edges. His eyes were bright and empty. He smiled like a hook. "You can ride a whole territory," he said, soft and amused. "Smoke still lives in the cloth." Her hand opened by its own accord. A tin cup she had been holding hit the floor and bounced. The sound went bright and sharp and kept going in her head. Heat rose off her skin in a hard wave. The shopkeeper's wife said something with worry in it and reached. Evelyn slipped past her and out the door into sun that stabbed. She did not stop at the watering trough. She did not look either way. She went down the street with her hat low and her mouth open, pulling air that would not fill. Her boots knocked dust up, and it stuck to her shins. Once her shoulder brushed a fence post and splinters bit. The bag cut her palm, then fell, and she left it where it dropped. She walked until the town became scrub, and the scrub became the cut of the north road. The ranch gate weighted tired rope looped over nail. She fumbled it. The rope came free and burned the skin between her thumb and finger. She went inside and closed the door without thought, then slid down the wall to the floor. The room breathed around her. She could not make her throat relax. Her eyes saw the seam in the floorboard near her boot and would not move from it. She did not light a lamp. The house slowed its pulse to meet hers. The day died and made space for other sounds. A horse blew in the yard, boots on the porch boards. No hand reached for the handle. No name said through the wood. After a while there was the quiet click of a plate set on floorboards, the soft weight of a folded cloth. The smell went under the door first. Stew that had been simmering a long time. Bread torn from the end of a loaf. Rowan's steps moved away and settled in the porch chair. The chair spoke to itself now and then, old slats shifting under weight. A rifle sat across knees. He did not clear his throat. He did not shift to look in the window. Evelyn curled tighter and let the dark be dark. The door kept air moving through the gap at the bottom and carried her the smell of thyme and onion and a hint of wood smoke that did not hurt. The night was long and clean of speech. When dawn pressed pale into the room, she stood and opened the door. The tray was there as promised by nothing but habit, a fresh bowl still steaming. The bread under the cloth was soft. On the threshold she saw a scatter of thin curls of wood, pale as the inside of a shell. They made a small fan on the boards near the rocker, as if a hand had worked something out by feel while the sky turned. Rowan was not in the chair. The rifle leaned against the wall. The chips of wood caught the first light and held it. Morning light caught on the curls of wood by the rocker and turned them pale gold. Evelyn crouched and picked one up. It bent without breaking. Resin sweetened her fingers. She set it on the windowsill and listened to the house wake. The kettle clicked as it warmed. A sparrow landed and scolded from the porch rail. The windmill took its slow first turn, and the old bearings answered in a soft groan. She found the tray at the door and ate standing spoon in one hand, cup in the other. The stew had cooled, but the thyme still rose and steadied her. When she finished, she folded the cloth and placed it where he would see it. She washed the bowl and set it to dry at the far end of the table. Small order soothed. Spoon handles all pointed the same way. The broom leaned in its corner and did not threaten. Work threaded the hours together. She scrubbed the basin. She shook the blanket and set it to sun on the porch rail. She learned the window that stuck in heat and the angle that made it slide. When she stepped outside with the bucket, she paused at the garden and touched a bloom with the back of her knuckle. The primrose held still under her touch as if not to frighten her. Rowan saddled and rode out before noon. He went without announcement, the gelding taking the slope to the road with a sure foot. His shirt was clean and his hat pulled low. The rifle stayed in its rack. He did not leave a word on paper. He did not need to. The yard carried the shape of his habits. By afternoon, Evelyn took the cloth purse and walked back toward town. Her bag from yesterday had not returned itself. The shopkeeper's wife would know if someone had brought it in or if she should buy again. The sky over Ash Mesa burned wide and flat. Heat lifted odors she had missed in the night. Creosote from the scrub, old flour from the store, horse sweat and rope. The bell on the general store door made a gentle sound when she pressed it. The shopkeeper's wife looked up and her hands opened without words. The woman reached under the counter and pulled out Evelyn's dropped bag dust, brushed from its canvas coins tied back into a corner. "Had a boy bring it?" she said. "I would have sent someone." "Thank you," Evelyn said. Her voice held. She left with calico and yeast and the bag folded under her arm. On the way back at the edge of town where the ground turns thin, she saw a small knot of people standing by the old Crowley place. The windmill there had not turned in months. Its blades were stiff with rust, and a chain hung slack. The pump below had been silent long enough to forget its purpose. Rowan stood with sleeves to his elbows and a smear of grease across one forearm. A hammer hung from his fingers. A can of oil sat open on a plank. He rolled his shoulder, once winced, then reached up to the hub and worked the pin loose with a careful twist. The metal let go with a sound like a sigh. He caught the pin in a rag and set it aside. Above him the blades shivered in a tiny test of freedom. Agnes Crowley watched from the porch. She leaned on a stick that had once been a broom handle. Her apron had a tear that had been mended with blue thread in crooked steps. She looked at Rowan like a woman who does not believe in favors but trusts in work. A man from the livery called out from the fence. "Langston tried that last spring," he said. "Pump is dead." Rowan did not answer. He checked the leather cup inside the cylinder and rubbed it with oil. He reset the chain, tightened the bolts with a wrench that looked older than he was, and stepped back. He put both hands on the pump handle, set his feet, and worked it in long pulls that woke the joint. The first stroke gave a dry groan. The second gave less. The third brought up a cough of brown. He kept at it. On the fifth, the pump cleared its throat and threw a thick rope of water into the trough. The sound was sudden and full, like a laugh that shakes a chest. Agnes set her stick aside and reached for the handle. Rowan stepped away so her hands could take it. She drew again, and water came as if it had been waiting for her grip. Someone asked how much he was charging. Rowan wiped his hands on a clean rag that had been a shirt sleeve and looked at no one. "Woman has no son," he said. "She needs water." He picked up the can of oil and closed it tight. He tightened the last bolt for habit's sake, then turned and walked past the watchers without taking their eyes with him. Evelyn stood still by the corner of a fence post and let him pass without speaking. He did not see her, or he did and gave her privacy by pretending not to. Back at the ranch, the house took her in with the same measure it had in the morning. She set the purchases on the table and folded the bag away. The sun dropped and took some heat with it. She lit the lamp and opened her journal. She did not write what he had done as a list. She wrote the way it had sounded when the pump gave in. She wrote what Agnes's hands had looked like wrapped around the handle knuckles, dark and sure. She wrote the way the first water fell clear after the brown, and how the sight of it quieted something in her throat. She closed the book. Her fingers rested on the cover a moment longer than needed. On the last shelf of the kitchen she found a small tin latch and 2 screws, and beside them a key with a flat bow. Someone had left them there with no note. She looked at the kitchen door and saw the mark in the wood where a latch would fit. When Rowan came in with his hat under his arm, he did not comment. He set the hammer on the table so it would be at hand, then turned the door so the edge faced him and held it steady. She set the latch and drove the screws in with care. The wood took the metal without protest. He folded his arms and watched the hinge line instead of her face. When she finished, he set the key on the table and slid it toward her. "For when you cook," he said, "if you want the room to yourself." "Thank you," she said. They ate without hurry. He told her the Northfield fence held that a calf had pushed through a weak place and come back with its nose bloodied and its pride intact. She told him the shopkeeper's wife had saved her bag. Their words were small and plain. Their eyes met and did not slide away. After dishes, he went out to the stable and she stirred the fire down to coals. The journal lay where she had left it on the arm of the chair, open enough to show the edge of a page. She went to her room and washed in the basin, then stood a while with the towel in her hands, damp on her knuckles. She heard the barn door slide and close, boots on the porch. The door eased open and shut. His steps paused in the doorway to the room. Rowan saw the book and reached for it to set it upright. The leather was warm from the lamp. The page had caught a fold. He smoothed it with his palm, meaning only to keep the paper from creasing. The line showed dark where her hand had pressed hard. He had not looked for words, and now they met him because he had dragged them into light. I came here to forget, not to fall in love. I married to leave that other place, not because I needed him. He stood still. The lamp made a low sound as the fuel took. In the quiet, his breath became the only measure. He closed the book with care and placed it exactly where it had been. He stepped back until his boots found the border of the rug, then kept going until the porch boards answered under him. He sat in the rocker. The chair said what it always said and no more. He did not turn his head toward her door. He did not say goodnight. Evelyn came out a little later with her hair braided and tucked. She saw the book as she had left it and thought it untouched. The porch held the shape of a man sitting alone in the dark. The rifle leaned against the wall. The night smelled of warm wood and the first faint hint of sage. She went to the hall and, kneeling, reached under the bed for the small lockbox she had not yet used. She opened it and took out the first key he had given her, the one that fit the room she had been given when she arrived. She stood at her door with the key in her palm. It was heavier than it had been that first day. She closed her fingers around it and felt the edge print into her skin. Then she set it on the threshold teeth toward the hall and left the door only partway closed. She blew out the lamp and let the dark be simple. The house listened as if it could keep both of them in the same breath. The air felt stalled at noon, a held breath over Juniper Well. Heat pressed down until the yard gave up sound. Even the windmill slowed to a lazy half-turn and rested. Evelyn moved through the kitchen with the latchkey in her apron pocket. She baked bread to keep her hands from shaking. Yeast and warm dough softened the room. She set the loaves to rise and stood still, palms white with flour, listening for something she could not name. Rowan came in from the corral with a coil of rope over his shoulder. His shirt clung at the shoulder where she had bandaged him. He took off his hat and wiped the salt from his brow. His eyes went to the open angle of her door and stayed off it. He filled a tin cup and drank at the sink. Water ran over his knuckles and slid to the floor in a thin line. "Fence holds," he said. She nodded. She wanted to say other things and could not find a starting word. He set the cup down, reached for the small crock of carbolic, and left it near the edge of the table where she would see it and not have to reach past him. Then he stepped back to the doorway and looked past the yard to the low line of sage. The smell came in small at first, riding under the yeast. Creosote, sharp and green. It belonged to rain or to fire. There were no clouds. Evelyn went to the porch and shaded her eyes. Far past the barn, beyond the stack of old posts, the ground showed a thread of moving dust that was wrong. The line did not drift. It crawled and lifted and turned darker. Rowan was already crossing the yard at a near run. He glanced once at the sky and once at the line of scrub. His voice landed clean. "Bucket," he said. "Wet cloth. Meet me at the well." She moved. The bucket bit her palm and steadied her. She drew water until the rope sang. She dipped cloth and twisted it hard and looped it around her neck. When she turned, she saw him at the barn, throwing the doors wide with a shove and clucking to the horses low in his throat. He brought two at a time, eyes narrowed against smoke that brushed the edges of the yard like the hem of a coat. Wind picked up from the west and tilted the world. Heat moved with it. The first lick of flame showed at the far fence, quick and playful, until it struck a run of dry grass. It changed shape, then took on purpose and began to feed. The sound came next. Not a crackle, something like a train inside the ground. Rowan looped a bandana around his mouth and nose. He pushed the last mare toward the creek cut, slapping her hip with a flat hand. Hooves tore the dry earth. The animals went with high heads, wild-eyed and angry at being made to move. He came back into smoke that had thickened to a visible thing. He did not look at the house. He looked at the line of flame and set his jaw. "Get low if it sweeps the porch," he said. "Keep the cloth wet." She nodded and ran for the pump again. The sky dulled. Ash fell in soft specks like gray snow. A spark settled on the rail and left a mark that smoked and went out. She soaked the blanket and dragged it toward the door, hands slipping on wet wool as it dragged her more than she dragged it. The porch boards were hot through the soles of her shoes. The fire found a run of sage and jumped the fence. It came at a slant, driven by the wind that had turned mean. One side of the barn took a line of it and glowed, then burst. The sound thumped her chest. She flinched and forced her breath steady. Rowan came out of the murk leading the last gelding. His shirt had gone dark with sweat. His eyes watered from the bandana. He handed the reins to Air, and the horse took them as if it understood and ran. "Evelyn," he called. "Outside. Now." The west side of the house took Ember through the cracks where the boards had shrunk. Wallpaper near the window curled in a grimace and darkened. The primrose in the kitchen window sagged and fell. The blanket dragged behind her like a sea. Evelyn looked at the stove at the table at the door to her room. Then she saw the fireplace by the front room, the hearthstone worn smooth by boots, and Ash, the low shelf with a leather book that had sat there as long as she had been in the house. It was thick and plain and had the look of something carried through too many miles. He never opened it at table. He held it at night without looking the way a man might keep a hand on a horse's neck to calm both of them. She saw it and moved. She pulled the band of cloth up over her mouth. Smoke made her eyes run. She went under it and breathed shallow and fast. The room had gone the color of pewter. Heat pushed at her face like a hand. She ducked under the gray and reached the shelf by feel. Her fingers found leather. It was warm and slick with soot. She held it tight against her ribs and turned. The doorway had gone strange. Fire took the curtains with a jealous hiss and tasted the wall. She bent low, grabbed the wet blanket, and flung it across the opening where flame wanted to climb. Steam burst and burned her forearm. Pain winked white. She kept moving. Rowan hit the porch steps 2 at a time and shouldered the door until the latch gave. He came through the wet wool like a shadow, eyes red and sharp. He saw the book in her arms and the blanket and her cough. He took her by the upper arm and pulled her into clean air that was not clean, but better. "What were you thinking?" he said. It did not rise. It broke on the last word. She could not find breath to answer for a second. She held the book out between them with both hands. The leather left a dark print on her shirt. "Not leaving it," she said, voice rough. "It is you when you say nothing." He looked at the book and then at her. Smoke made tears at the corners of his eyes, but there was something else living there too. The wind hit the yard hard enough to stagger them both. The fire grabbed at the porch posts and began to climb. He pulled the blanket up and over them and dragged her toward the cut of Dry Creek, which hid itself behind a stand of willow scrub and a fall of dirt. The bank was steep. He went down first, handed her the weight of the blanket, then reached up to take her wrist. His palm was hot and rough. She slid, got a knee muddy, and landed with a small splash in the trickle that always ran even in hard summer. The water climbed her skirts and cooled the heat in her legs until her skin hurt from relief. He soaked the blanket again and threw it over their shoulders. Smoke took the creek bed in a passing wave and moved on. Above them the sky roared. The heat sucked the air thin. Evelyn pressed her face to wet wool and breathed through the threads. Her heart slowed 1 beat at a time. Her hand found his arm under the blanket and stayed there. She felt the jump of his muscle, then the way it eased under her fingers. They stayed until the sound changed and the wind sanded the top of the bank instead of trying to crawl down it. He lifted the edge of the blanket. Daylight came back strange and colored like old brass. Ash fell on the water and made small rings that drifted until the current took them. The yard looked scraped raw. The barn slumped on one side. The house stood blackened along the west wall, smoke licking from a cracked pane. Rowan pushed up the bank and turned, offering his hand. She took it. The world felt heavy, like the air had picked up stones. They walked slow across ground that had kept its shape. The primrose by the window had gone to gray lace. The juniper stump near the back fence wore a collar of soot. In its center, a green tip showed where no green had been the day before. Rowan stopped and looked at that small newness until his breathing steadied. He released her hand to cover his own mouth with his forearm and coughed until it loosened whatever the smoke had hooked inside him. When he could speak, he lowered his arm and looked at her, not past her. "You went back into a burning room," he said. "You were sending horses," she said. "I could not carry a horse." Silence took them and made room for more. He held out his right arm. The skin along his forearm had reddened and the edges had begun to pucker. She touched near the worst of it, quick and gentle, and felt the heat there. "Inside," she said. "Water, salve." He nodded. They went to the pump and rinsed black from their hands. She found clean cloth and cool water and set him at the table. He sat without argument. She cleaned the burn with careful hands. He did not pretend it did not hurt. He bit the inside of his cheek and watched the side of her face. He saw the soot on her jaw and reached without touching to show her the place with a gesture. She wiped it and found another line of black, and they both laughed once, not from humor, but from some pressure leaving. She wrapped his arm and tied the cloth with the knot that holds and gives. He looked at the knot as if it were a word he recognized. He dropped his eyes to the book on the table between them. Soot had smudged the cover and made the leather shine darker. He set his fingertips on it and left a clean half-moon where ash stayed on his skin. "I did not mean for you to see this," he said. "I did not read it," she said. "Did not need to." He traced the edge of the cover once. His nails were rimmed black. He did not open it. "I saw what you wrote," he said at last night. She let the words sit. The wind went by the window and ruffled a hanging strip of ruined wallpaper. She lifted her chin and kept her eyes on his. "It was true when I wrote it," she said. "I wrote the part after this morning, too." He waited. "I wrote that I see you," she said, "and it hurts to think my slowness could cost me the place where I stand easy." He looked at her mouth like he was learning the shape of the words there. He set his palm flat on the table and then turned it over so it lay open. He did not reach. "I wait fine," he said. "Been waiting since I was old enough to choose not to light a match." She breathed and felt the kitchen come back around them one small measure at a time. The kettle clicked. A drop from the roof found the rim of a bucket and pinged. The windmill protested once and turned. He pushed his chair back and stood. He crossed to the window and set his palm on the blackened frame. The soot took his print. He looked down at the yard where the green tip on the charred stump moved in a breeze that had found its way back. She closed the book and held it for a second longer than a closing needs. Then she stood and moved to the stove where a pot of water had managed to simmer under the heat that had tried to take the house. She brewed coffee because the ritual calmed both of them. She poured him a cup and set it near his uninjured hand. He took it and looked up. The quiet between them did not feel like absence. On the porch, the rocker sat where it always sat. On the boards beside it lay a small piece of juniper wood pail where a blade had cut it clean. Rowan reached down and picked it up. He turned it in his fingers, rubbed away a bit of soot with his thumb, and slipped it into his pocket. He did not say why. He did not have to. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in along the fence lines, green the size of a fingernail, a thin seam where blackened earth parted. The wind shifted off the mesa and lost its teeth. The windmill took a breath, turned, and did not complain. When it did squeak, Rowan set a ladder and touched oil to the hub until the blades went quiet as a hand over a heartbeat. Evelyn worked the back garden with her sleeves rolled. Soil gave under her fingers and left half-moons of dark beneath her nails. She planted in short rows, not many, just enough to make the yard look like a place that expected tomorrow. Evening primrose came up in pale cups and held the light near dusk. When she stood and pressed the small of her back, she could smell damp roots and warm boards and the faint sweetness of juniper sap. The kitchen latch settled into habit. If she wanted the room, she turned the key and heard the soft catch. If she left it undone, the door breathed with the house. The leather book lived on the table more days than not, and neither of them minded its presence. Sometimes Rowan's palm rested on the cover as he talked about the north field or a mare with a soft foot. Sometimes she wiped a bit of soot from the spine that no wash had taken out. It did not go away. It did not need to. They carried 2 buckets of water to Agnes Crowley on a hot afternoon when the pump at her place coughed and then steadied. Agnes took 1 bucket and looked at them both in that way that says more than thank you. Her porch boards had a new nail where a split had opened. Rowan noticed and set his heel on it, then glanced at the stick by her door. Later, a hammer would find its way to that porch. No one would talk about it. Nights were different now. The rocker on the porch kept its rhythm. Wood curls gathered at Rowan's boot. He worked a piece of juniper the size of his thumb with a small knife he kept honed to a soft white edge. Shavings fell in thin ribbons that twined like river water on the boards. He did not rush. The blade knew when to lift and when to bite. Evelyn sat on the step with her journal closed beside her. Words did not always come. That seemed fine. One morning the air felt new. Creosote carried a clean scent that belongs to rain even when there are no clouds. Rowan shaved with care and nicked himself once along the jaw. He chose a shirt without fray and buttoned it all the way to his throat, then unbuttoned the top too, because it felt like he was pretending to be someone else. He came to the back door and stood there with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the yard. "Come with me," he said. Evelyn wiped her palms on her apron and followed him toward the far fence where the ground fell gently. The stump that fire had ringed wore new growth now. 2 shoots had thickened and shifted from tender to sure. They moved a little in a small wind taller than her knee. Rowan stopped in their shade and stood quiet until his breathing matched the leaves. He turned to her. He reached into his pocket and brought out a ring of dark wood that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. The grain swirled like water pulled around a stone. The inner edge had been sanded smooth until it felt like skin. The outer edge still carried one fine line of pale where the blade had first entered. "From what did not burn," he said, "from what kept living." He went down on one knee. He did not look away. The moment felt simple as a cup set on a table. He cleared his throat. "Marry me proper," he said. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed once. Heat rose into her face and cooled just as fast. She did not hear birds or wind or the far sound of water in Dry Creek. She saw the scar at his temple and the way his fingers shook 1 degree and steadied. She put out her hand and it trembled. Not with fear. Something else sharper and good. "Yes," she said. He stood and slid the ring over her knuckle. The wood warmed fast on her skin. It seated in a way that felt like an answer she had been saying under her breath for weeks. She did not kiss him. She stepped closer and put her palm on his chest where the cloth rose and fell. He let out a breath he had been holding for longer than the moment required. Back at the house, she went to her room and opened the small drawer with its private click. Inside lay the first brass key he had given her on the day she arrived bright against dark wood. She carried it to the kitchen where Rowan stood with his hat still in his hand like he had forgotten where to set it. She took his free hand, turned it palm up, and placed the key there. The metal looked small against his work marks and healed cuts. He did not close his fingers yet. She walked to her door, turned the latch, and left it open to the angle that let air pass and shadow hold. His hand closed around the key. He crossed to the hook by the window and hung it there where the sun could find it in the afternoon. It caught a thin line of light and gave it back to the wall. He turned and met her eyes. No rush, no performance. The house felt larger without anyone moving. They cooked together that night for no reason except that it seemed right. He sliced onions and cried and blamed the knife. She laughed and nearly burned the first pan of cornbread and swore at the stove. They ate on the porch and shared the cup of coffee that had gone too strong. The wind lifted the edges of the napkin and set it down again. The sky went violet at the rim and held the last of the heat like a secret. When the plates were stacked and the lamp turned low, Evelyn stood in the yard and spread her toes in the cool dust. She held out her hand. He looked at it then at her, and stepped into the space between them, like a man stepping through a gate he had fixed himself. She set her left hand at his shoulder, and he set his right at the small of her back. They moved without music. The windmill turned and counted for them. The juniper leaves answered. Somewhere a nighthawk took the air and made its low sound. They did not talk. The ring pressed cool, then warm against skin. The kitchen window threw a friendly square of lamplight onto the ground that rocked back and forth with their steps. When they stopped, she kept her palm against his chest for a while longer, and he kept his hand at her back as if afraid the air might startle her. Later, when the house settled and the rocker sighed, she set the leather book on the table and opened it to a blank page. She did not write. She left it waiting. He sat across from her with his burned arm bandaged clean and his jaw shaved smooth and watched the page as if words had weight you could hear when they landed. Outside, the wind changed and came in from the north. It carried cool over the scorched west wall and through the open door. It picked up the scent of primrose and damp soil and laid it gently through the rooms. The windmill turned 3 even times and rested. The house breathed. The night held. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.